What if you were suddenly thrown into the brutal world of the Middle Ages? No phone, no medicine, no mercy. Think you'd survive? Think again. Welcome to a world where diseases had no cure, justice meant public torture, and bathing was considered suspicious. Today, we're taking you deep into the grim reality of medieval life, and trust us, you wouldn't last a day. If you're someone who feels a chill down your spine when history whispers its forgotten tales, if you find beauty in broken crowns, lost empires, and powerful souls who changed the world, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Dark Historian Tales, the channel where we bring the shadows of the past into the light, through emotional storytelling, raw truths, and dramatic journeys that shaped humanity. This isn't just history, it's the heartbeat of those who lived, loved, lost, and left a legacy. Backhand index pointing, right? So if you love powerful historical stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. Because here, history doesn't just speak. It haunts. The first thing you feel is the cold. Not a chill, not discomfort, but a deep, bone-cracking cold that makes your muscles tense before your mind is even fully awake. Your eyes flutter open, but there is no light, just a gray haze leaking in through the slats of crude wooden boards. The air smells of damp straw, rotting wood, old sweat, and something sour and sharp. Urine, maybe. Your skin itches immediately. Something is crawling. Fleas. Lice. You don't know, but they're alive, and they're in your bed, if you can call it that. Just a flattened pile of straw laid on cold dirt. You try to stretch, but your body aches. Your joints throb as though you've been beaten. You haven't. Not yet. But sleep, in this world, offers no rest. You are sleeping in your clothes, rags really, and they're damp, stiff, and soiled. You wore them yesterday. You wore them the day before. You might wear them for months. There is no second pair. A draft slips through the cracks in the walls, and your body shudders. The hut is barely more than a crooked wooden box held together by mud and hope. No insulation. No glass windows. Just open gaps, through which the wind whistles like a dying man. There is a fire pit in the middle of the room, but the embers are long dead. Firewood is scarce. You burned the last of it last night. You have nothing left but damp twigs and your own breath, now steaming in the bitter air. You sit up. The straw crackles under you, releasing a cloud of dust and pests. Your stomach growls. Not a cute little grumble. A sharp, twisting pain that feels like something inside is eating you. You didn't eat dinner. There was no dinner. Yesterday, you had a crust of bread, so hard it cut the roof of your mouth, and some weak ale. No fruit. No meat. Not even a vegetable. Hunger is a companion. It never leaves you. It only grows quieter or louder. Your feet touch the dirt floor. It's cold as stone. You don't have shoes. Not real ones. Just scraps of leather bound around your feet with rope. You move slowly, every movement deliberate, cautious. Not because you have time, but because you don't have energy. You're already exhausted, and the sun hasn't even risen. A low sound groans from the corner. Your younger sibling, maybe, or your child. Or your spouse. You share this single room with them all. Privacy is a luxury unknown. You all sleep together, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes with a goat or a chicken inside for warmth. The animal shifts. It stinks, but it's valuable. You can't afford to lose it. You crawl to the doorway. There is no door, just a curtain of rough fabric. You push it aside and step into the morning. The sky is leaden, heavy with clouds that promise rain or worse. The mud outside squelches under your feet. It never dries. The ground here is always wet, always sucking at your feet like it wants to pull you under. Smoke rises from other hovels in the distance. You see figures moving, not walking but limping, dragging themselves into the day like corpses that forgot to stay dead. No one speaks. Words waste breath. You nod at a neighbor. They don't nod back. They're too tired. You shuffle toward the well. It's a good 100 yards away. Your village has only one, and even that is suspect. The water tastes of iron and earth. Sometimes it smells bad. People get sick from it. but it's all you have. You fill a bucket, muscles screaming, arms trembling. The weight is too much, but you can't return empty-handed. Back home, your family waits. You ration the water, first to drink, then to wash a little. Not to be clean. No one is truly clean, but just to feel less sticky, less foul. You splash some on your face. It's freezing. It shocks you awake for a moment. Then you go about the morning's real task, survival. You check the food stores, a wooden box covered with a cloth. There's almost nothing inside. A heel of bread, a few onions already sprouting, maybe a bit of lard if rats haven't gotten to it. Your hands tremble. You slice the bread into tiny portions, one for each person. You boil water, toss in the onions. It's more broth than soup, but it's warm. As the others eat, you think of the field. Your true day hasn't started yet. You have work to do. The land calls. Whether it's yours or the Lord's, it doesn't matter. You must plant, dig, gather, haul. You must pay your dues or risk punishment. But before you go, you glance at your hands. They're cracked, bleeding at the knuckles, dirt deep under the nails. They look like they belong to someone much older. You are only 23. But in this world, that's middle-aged. You whisper a short prayer. Not because you're devout, but because it's the only thing left to do. The day has begun. And already, it feels like you've survived a war. You survived the morning barely. Your body aches, your stomach gnaws, your mind is already frayed. But there's no time to rest. As the day crawls forward, the true danger begins to reveal itself, not in swords or punishment, but in the invisible enemies that stalk every breath you take. Diseases in the medieval world weren't just common. They were expected. Illness wasn't a disruption. It was part of life. You cough once, then again. Your throat burns. A fever starts to rise, and a chill dances down your spine. Already, you're afraid. Because here, even a small cough could mean the beginning of the end. There are no doctors. Not really. A barber might pull a rotten tooth. A midwife might say a prayer. But no one knows what a virus is. No one understands bacteria. People believe that bad smells, evil spirits, or your own sins cause disease. The only advice you'll hear is to pray harder, bleed yourself, or drink some boiling herbs. And if you get worse, you're on your own. The most terrifying part isn't the pain. It's the helplessness. You feel your strength slipping away, slowly, day by day, and no one can stop it. Your neighbors avoid you. They think you're cursed. Even your own family steps back, whispering prayers under their breath. Fear spreads faster than the sickness. If you're lucky, it's just a cough. If you're unlucky, it could be anything else. The pox, the flux, the sweat. Words that don't mean much to you now, but back then, they were death sentences. The Black Death, yes, that plague killed millions. Entire villages disappeared. And it wasn't a thing of the past. It came in waves, again and again. You don't know what you have. No one does. One day you're working in the field. The next day, your skin is blistering. Your eyes swell shut. Your breath shortens. You lie on the dirt floor, shivering, hallucinating, while your family lights candles and whispers to the saints. No ambulance. No medicine. No hope. The stench of sickness hangs in the air. You're not alone. A child screams in the distance. Someone is burying a loved one just a few huts down. There's no formal grave, just a pit covered in lime. The priest chants something, barely audible over the wind. Death is not a shock anymore. It's a routine. Even if you survive, you won't be the same. Disease marks you, scars your skin, weakens your limbs, dulls your mind. You become slower, more fragile, easier to break. You're still alive, yes, but in this world, sometimes that feels like a cruel joke. There's no escaping it. No rich man, no knight, no priest is immune. Kings have died foaming at the mouth. Queens have wasted away coughing blood. Sickness doesn't care who you are. All it needs is a host. And if you're wondering about hygiene, there is none. You wash rarely, if ever. Baths are feared, They open the pores and let in bad spirits, they say. People cover smells with perfumes, not soap. Sewage runs through the streets. Rats and flies are your neighbors. Every cut, every scratch is a threat. Infection doesn't knock. It crashes in. And there's more. Leprosy,
Smallpox,
tuberculosis,
typhoid.
malaria. Every day is a gamble. Every symptom a warning. You listen closely to your body because one wrong signal might mean the end. No future. No legacy. Just a shallow grave and a name no one remembers. You lie awake at night, not just cold, but afraid. Afraid that tomorrow you won't wake up. Or worse, that you will. That you'll live through the agony and have to watch someone you love go through it too. This is life in the Middle Ages. Not war, not swords, not glory, but silent, creeping death. You've made it through mourning. You've braved the cold, the hunger, and the silent threat of disease. But now you face something even darker, something crafted by human hands, fueled by fear, control, and cruelty. Welcome to the justice system of the Middle Ages, a world not of law, but of vengeance. Not of order, but of spectacle. Here, justice doesn't mean fairness. It means pain. And it comes swiftly, without warning, and almost always without mercy. The moment you step outside, you can feel it hanging in the air like smoke, fear. The villagers speak in hushed tones. Eyes dart, heads lower. No one wants to be noticed. Because being noticed means being accused. And being accused, that could mean your end. You don't need evidence. You don't need witnesses. You just need a rumor, a whisper, a wrong glance. Maybe someone says your cow gave less milk. Maybe a child cried near your home. Maybe someone's bread didn't rise, and now you're to blame. They call you a witch, a thief, a liar. That's all it takes. You're dragged from your home. There's no warning, no explanation. Just hands grabbing you, shouting, spit hitting your face. The town gathers quickly. Justice is entertainment. They jeer. They throw stones. Some children laugh. Your heart is racing, not just from fear, but from confusion. You haven't done anything, but it doesn't matter. You've been chosen. You're taken to the center of town. There is no court, no lawyer, no chance to speak. Just a platform, a rope, maybe a set of iron tools laid out for all to see. The magistrate reads your crime. The crowd doesn't need proof. They only need blood. If you're lucky, they'll go easy.
A fine.
A branding. A public shaming, tied to a post while villagers spit and throw filth at you. But luck is rare, especially if you're poor, or female, or alone. Then they'll want more. They'll want a confession.
And to get one?
They'll use whatever it takes. You're taken underground. The dungeon is not a room, it's a tomb. It reeks of mold, rot, and centuries of pain. The walls are damp. Chains rattle in the darkness. You're stripped, humiliated, bound. There is no light except the torch that flickers, casting monstrous shadows. The torturer doesn't ask if you're guilty. He doesn't care. He's here for a performance. He stretches your limbs on the rack. Your joints scream as they're pulled apart. Your vision blurs. You beg, but no one hears. Or if they do, they enjoy it. Some nobles watch for pleasure. Some priests call it purification. Still don't confess?
The tools change.
Hot irons pressed to your skin. Your nails ripped out. Your feet crushed under boards and weights. You will confess eventually. Everyone does. Innocence is irrelevant. The pain rewrites the truth. And when you do confess, when your voice finally breaks and the lie spills out, they cheer. The village gets what it wants. Closure, a scapegoat, a body. You're paraded through the streets. Sometimes you're hanged. Sometimes burned. Sometimes left to rot in a cage as a warning. But even if you're not killed, you're never free. Branded faces. Missing fingers. Shackled legs. These are the signs of someone who has faced justice. You become a walking reminder. You lose work. You lose family. You lose the fragile safety you once had. And it's not just for witches or crimes. The justice system touches everyone. A hungry man steals bread. He's flogged until he bleeds. A woman speaks too freely. Her tongue is pierced or her mouth locked in an iron gag. A boy breaks something by accident. He's beaten in the square. There is no mercy, no appeals, no protection. Even the church, with its sermons of love and forgiveness, runs its own system. And it is worse. If you are accused of heresy, there are no second chances. They say the body must be destroyed to save the soul.
And they mean it.
Inquisitors come with black robes and sharper questions. If you survive their trials, you're broken. If you don't, you're forgotten, burned at the stake, buried in secret, or left to rot in a pit where no prayers are spoken. The worst part? Sometimes the accused are innocent. Sometimes they're children. Sometimes it's just politics or land disputes or jealousy. Truth becomes a luxury no one can afford. Justice is not blind. It is cruel, watching everything with open eyes and a twisted grin. You cannot fight it. You cannot hide from it. You live each day wondering, who will they come for next? And when it's your turn, because it always is, you pray not for rescue, but for a quick end. This is justice in the Middle Ages. Not a system, a sentence, not to find the truth, but to remind you who holds the power. Imagine waking up to the gnawing pain of hunger, not because you missed a meal by choice, but because food simply didn't exist. There was no breakfast waiting on a stove. There was no clean water to pour into a glass. The firewood was wet, the hearth was cold, and your stomach groaned for mercy. In the Middle Ages, famine wasn't rare, it was expected. And when the crops failed and the larders emptied, the world didn't wait for a solution. It watched you starve. The medieval food crisis wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was a lingering monster. Fields battered by storms or parched by drought yielded almost nothing. Grain was gold. Bread became thinner, darker, harder, sometimes made with bark or ground acorns just to fill space. Children died with bloated bellies. Old men collapsed in fields they once tilled. Mothers watched their babies waste away and prayed not for miracles, but for quicker deaths. If you lived in a village, your fate was tied to the land. And when the land betrayed you, starvation took over your body slowly, deliberately, cruelly. Your energy would fade. Your limbs would weaken. Your skin would pale. You'd stop crying not because you'd found peace, but because you had no tears left. That's the kind of famine that the Middle Ages brought. Not a sudden crash, but a creeping, choking fade. And it wasn't just food that was missing. The water that trickled from rivers and wells was often laced with death. Contaminated and unfiltered, drinking it was like gambling with poison. Typhoid, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases flourished in communities where ignorance was widespread and solutions were non-existent. If you were lucky enough to afford food, your meal was still a risky affair. Meat was rare and expensive, mostly reserved for nobles. The peasants ate gruel, porridge, stale bread, cabbage, onions, and root vegetables, if anything at all. There were no fridges, no preservatives, no guarantee that what you ate wouldn't make you vomit blood by nightfall. Spoiled food was often disguised with strong spices or sour vinegars just to mask the rot. And yet there were feasts, but not for you. The lords and clergy feasted while the poor watched. They drank wine while peasants drank ditch water. They gorged on roasted birds and pies while mothers begged in silence for scraps. The divide between the full and the famished was not just economic, it was spiritual. The suffering of the masses was seen as God's will, a punishment for sin, or a necessary balance to the luxury of the elite. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, heavy rains drowned Europe's crops. Harvests failed for years. Livestock died from disease and hunger. Grain prices soared beyond imagination. People sold everything, tools, clothes, even their children, for food. Some abandoned their homes, walking from village to village in search of mercy that never came. In the darkest corners of starvation, humanity broke. Cannibalism was whispered, suspected, even witnessed. Imagine the horror. You're walking down a muddy village path. You see a woman crouched over something, crying. As you approach, you realize she's eating something raw, something human. not out of madness, out of hunger, because she wants to live just one more day. And famine didn't just kill bodies, it broke societies. When you're starving, you don't care about rules, neighbors, or faith. You steal. You fight.
You lie.
You turn against your friends. You bury your children with bare hands. You sell your soul in exchange for moldy barley. Morality dies long before your body does. Now, imagine you're not a peasant, but a child. You wake up in a home that smells of dirt and despair. Your mother is coughing. Your father hasn't returned in days. Your younger siblings are crying. No tears, just shallow sobs. You look into the pot. There's nothing. The rats have fled. Even they know what's coming. You hear about a neighboring village where people are eating dogs. Another where the dead are being dug up.
You don't cry.
You just wait. This was the Middle Ages. This was real. And there was no safety net. Monasteries, often the only sources of charity, ran out of bread. Nobles locked their gates. The clergy preached patience and prayer while their tables overflowed. Starvation became a ritual, a seasonal agony, a birthright passed down like blood. And when food returned, it was too late for many. Villages were empty. Fields were wild. Graves were fresh. Those who survived bore the scars for life. Bones misshapen from malnutrition, minds warped by suffering, hearts hardened by loss. You wouldn't have lasted long. Not in a world where hunger was the law and famine the enforcer. Where every bite was a miracle and every day alive was defiance. That's the reality of medieval life. That's what they don't show in the fairy tales. No grand banquet. No noble night. Just hunger. Endless, brutal hunger. It begins with silence, not the gentle stillness of a peaceful morning, but the kind that clings to narrow alleys, heavy with expectation. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of voice, of choice, of worth.
You didn't own your life.
You were born to serve, to obey, and to disappear in a world built by and for men. But beneath that silence simmered strength, quiet as a whisper, patient as a prayer. Let us walk in her shoes. You wake before the sun. There's no bed, just a sack of straw that scratches your skin and smells of mildew. Beside you, your children stir, curled like kittens, thin from hunger. Your husband is already gone, likely to the fields or the forge, and whatever warmth you shared during the night has vanished into the cold breath of dawn. Your day doesn't begin. It resumes. Because it never really ends. Your fingers are cracked, your nails blackened by the grime that no soap will ever wash away. If you're lucky, you have a patch of bread to soak in weak ale for breakfast. If you're not, you tie a cloth around your waist to trick your stomach into feeling full. There is no room for complaint. Hunger is not a tragedy, it is routine. As you carry water from the well, your back already aches. The wooden bucket bruises your hip with each step. The walk is long and dangerous. A passing man might grope you or worse, but to scream would shame you, not him. And justice? You've seen what it does to women who speak too loud. You wash clothes in icy water, kneading them like dough, beating them against stones until your knuckles bleed. Then you tend to the animals, the children, the firewood, the food, if there is any, all while pregnant, or healing from childbirth, or grieving a baby born too early, too weak, or not at all. And no one listens. You are a peasant woman, married by 14, mother of 5 by 25, old by 35. If your husband dies, you are property to be passed along with his estate. If you die, no one writes your name. No one marks your grave. But not all women suffer in the same way. In the manor, the lady of the house wears silks and velvet. She speaks French or Latin. But even in luxury, she is a prisoner. Her marriage is a transaction. Her body, a vessel for heirs. Her thoughts, they don't matter. Behind every smile lies restraint. Behind every stitch of embroidery, a dream choked silent. Nuns fare better sometimes. In convents, women can read, write, even lead. They pray, they teach. But many are sent there against their will, cloistered away not by faith, but by fathers. A nun's veil may hide a broken heart, a rebellious soul crushed beneath piety. And then there are the others, the outcasts, widows, herbalists, midwives. Too independent, too loud, too strange. They whisper with the moon, heal with herbs, and know too much. These women often meet a darker fate, accused of witchcraft, tied to stakes, drowned or burned. Their sin? Living unafraid. Yet, despite it all, medieval women endure. They weave their strength into tapestries, hide their knowledge in gardens and remedies, pass their wisdom from mother to daughter in lullabies and laments. They love fiercely, fight silently, live without asking permission. Some rise. A few, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Hildegard of Bingen, break the mold. But for every woman who makes the history books, there are thousands whose stories are buried beneath dust and silence. And still, they mattered. You think you could handle it? Could you survive childbirth with no doctors? Could you raise 6 children while fearing your husband's temper and society's judgment? Could you walk a village street with eyes cast down, knowing one misstep means ruin? Could you remain whole when the world insists you are less than half? The truth is, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, your life was not your own. Your body, your voice, your dreams, they belonged to others. But even in the darkness, women found ways to live, to love, and to leave their mark, however faint. So, if you think medieval life was all feasts and fairy tales, think again. Because behind every shining knight, every crowned king, every robed monk, there was a woman unseen. And she bore the weight of a world that refused to see her. The deafening clang of iron against iron. The shrieks of men collapsing under the weight of sharpened steel. The ground, slick with blood, reeked of death and smoke. If you thought your worst day involved office politics or traffic, think again. In the medieval world, war wasn't a distant news headline, it was life and death. And often the only path to honor or disgrace. Imagine you're a peasant, drafted overnight by your lord's messenger. No training, no preparation, no choice. You're handed a wooden spear, maybe a rusted helmet, and thrust into a war you don't understand. The only command you hear is, fight or die. Medieval warfare wasn't about glory, it was organized chaos. Armies of thousands marched on foot, their chainmail armor clinking with each step, each man hoping he'd still have his limbs by sunset. Archers released volleys of arrows like deadly rain. Cavalry charged like thunder, their hooves pounding so loud you'd think the earth itself wanted to flee. And then came the siege warfare, the stuff of nightmares. Cities weren't just invaded, they were starved, crushed, burned. Siege weapons like trebuchets hurled rocks the size of wagons. Disease and rot festered inside city walls as food ran out and hope died faster than the wounded. And yet, defending your city was seen as an act of honor. Knights, despite their polished image in modern fairy tales, weren't noble gentlemen in shining armor. They were ruthless, trained from childhood to kill with precision. Their loyalty lay with whoever paid them the most. On the battlefield, they were unstoppable tanks, slashing, trampling, maiming. There were no medics waiting with 4 drips. If you were injured, your fate depended on luck and superstition. A sword slash to the leg might be treated by cauterization, burning the wound shut with a red-hot iron. Infection? Amputation. Pain relief? If you were lucky, strong ale or opium. Most just screamed and died. And then there was conscription, drafting men into battles that lasted months, even years. Some never returned. Others came back broken, missing limbs, blinded, or haunted by what they'd seen. PTSD had no name back then, only whispers of madness and nightmares. But war wasn't just for men. Women defended homes, poisoned invading soldiers, acted as spies, or were victims of unspeakable atrocities. They faced raiders, watched children die from hunger during sieges, and sometimes took up arms when no one else remained. You might think you'd hide, flee, or fake illness to escape war. But in a world without rights, your body belonged to your lord, your king, your army. You fought because if you didn't, your family might pay the price. Blood soaked into the soil. Bones buried beneath castles and fields. War in the Middle Ages wasn't a game. It was a machine that chewed up generations and spat out ashes. So, next time you're stuck in traffic or annoyed at a Zoom call, remember, at least you're not storming a fortress with nothing but a rusted sword and blind hope. And this was just another ordinary day in medieval life. In the shadow of castles and cathedrals, in the spaces between royal proclamations and knightly legends, lived the invisible majority, the peasants. Their lives were not recorded in gilded manuscripts or sung by wandering minstrels, but their toil kept the wheels of medieval society turning. This chapter delves into their unforgiving reality, a world of dirt floors, aching backs, and ceaseless struggle. Imagine waking up before the sun rises, your bed not a mattress, but a bundle of straw swarming with lice. The air is cold, the kind of damp chill that creeps into your bones and never quite leaves. Your first breath carries the scent of manure and mildew. You don't bathe regularly because water is scarce and soap is a luxury. If you live to see 30, you're one of the lucky ones. You start the day in silence. There's no time for reflection, no luxury for a slow stretch. You rise, grab a wooden tool, maybe a hoe or a scythe, and make your way into the fields. Rain or shine, you work. The land is not yours. You are bound to it by the weight of generational obligation. Serfdom, though not technically slavery, is a sentence written in dirt. Your lord owns the field and everything it yields, including your energy and time. Breakfast, if it exists, is a chunk of stale bread and weak ale. The bread is rough, dense, often made with barley or rye and sometimes stretched with ground beans, or even bark to make it last. Ale is safer than water, which is often polluted with human and animal waste. You drink not for intoxication, but to survive. The field doesn't care about your blisters or your exhaustion. You dig, you sow, you harvest, and when you can't, you still try. Because to fall behind is to invite punishment. The Lord Steward will come knocking, demanding tribute, grain, eggs, poultry, regardless of how poor the harvest has been. You pay taxes to the church as well. The tithe claims a tenth of everything, even if that tenth leaves your family starving. The village priest may offer comfort, but he also enforces divine judgment. God, you're told, has placed you in this station for a reason. Suffering, they say, is the pathway to salvation. And so you suffer. Your home is a single-room hut with a thatched roof and mud walls. In winter, the wind slips through the cracks, and rats scurry across the floor at night. Your livestock, if you're fortunate enough to have any, sleep inside with you. Chickens underfoot, a goat tied to the post. Their warmth is your only defense against the cold. When illness strikes, there's no doctor to call. You might summon the village healer, who applies a poultice made of herbs, spit, and whispered prayers. But if the fever rises or the wound festers, you prepare for death. Children die often. So often, in fact, that some mothers no longer name them until they survive the first year. Festivals are rare, but they do exist. Saint days or harvest celebrations where the ale flows a little freer, the music plays a little louder. You dance in a ring with your neighbors, forgetting for a moment the burden of your life. But when the sun sets, you return to your obligations. And then there is war. When your lord is summoned by the king or the baron, he in turn summons you. You don't have a choice. You are not a trained fighter, but you're handed a spear or a club and marched into battle. There's no armor for you, just the hope that you won't be in the front line. You witness the carnage, limbs severed, screams echoing, fire consuming villages. If you survive, you return home changed. If not, your family carries on without you, their grief silenced by hunger. There's no upward mobility, no dream of getting out. Even the most ambitious peasant is trapped by a system so rigid it feels eternal. Your best hope might be sending a son to the monastery, if he can read, or praying for a plague to kill the Lord and leave his estate in chaos. And still, through this bleakness, there is resilience. Peasants build bonds, familial, communal, sacred. They share loaves of bread, pass stories around the fire, help one another during lean seasons. They laugh sometimes. A child's first step, a successful harvest, a particularly warm spring. These moments shine like gold dust in the mud. Their endurance is legendary, their role foundational. Without peasants, there is no castle, no knight, no king. They are the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, though history often forgets them. So when you imagine the romantic medieval world, remember that it was built on backs that bent and broke under its weight. The peasants bore it all and they endured. In the labyrinth of medieval existence, where every breath carried the weight of uncertainty, religion wasn't merely a part of life. It was life itself. It governed the rhythm of the days, dictated the hopes of the soul, and served as both comfort and chain. To the peasants, who toiled under the sun and bled into the earth they worked, the church was their only beacon of light and their deepest well of fear. The stone walls of every village church echoed not just with hymns, but with the cries of those desperate for salvation and the whispers of superstition that passed from one generation to the next like sacred relics. Imagine waking each day not with thoughts of purpose or ambition, but with dread of disease, famine, war, or the wrath of a God whose favor was unpredictable. If your child fell ill, it was a sign. If your crops withered, it was a punishment. If a storm destroyed your home, you hadn't prayed enough. And yet, the church did not offer answers. It offered rituals. It offered hope veiled in Latin, sermons delivered in tongues you did not understand, and sacraments that cost you coin you didn't possess. Priests, the shepherds of these lost flocks, wielded immense power. To speak against them was heresy. To question their word was to defy not just them, but the Almighty. They decided who was righteous, who was sinful, and who would burn. They read from books no one else could read, and so they owned the truth, an unchallengeable monopoly over salvation. And beyond these sacred halls, the Inquisition loomed, a force not of spiritual guidance, but of fear incarnate. Torture was not barbarism in their eyes. It was divine correction. The rack, the wheel, the branding iron, all tools of purification in the name of God. But religion in the medieval mind was not always pure doctrine. It was also fear of the unseen. Superstition bled through every crack of Christian teaching. You carried talismans to ward off evil spirits. You avoided black cats, the number 13, and women with crooked backs. A bad harvest might be blamed on a neighbor accused of witchcraft. A baby's death could lead to an old widow being tied to a stake. And all of this, every fear, every burned body, every tear shed, happened in the shadow of the cathedral, in the name of holy righteousness. Pilgrimages were a common act of devotion, with men and women walking hundreds of miles barefoot across dangerous terrain, praying for healing, forgiveness, or divine favor. These journeys were brutal, often deadly. But what choice did you have when your only chance at healing a festering wound or surviving the plague was believed to lie in touching a relic, perhaps a splinter of the true cross or a saint's finger preserved in silver? Some did it out of desperation, others for penance, and a few out of guilt that gnawed so deep it followed them in their dreams. Monasteries, though seen as places of peace, were not spared from corruption. While some monks lived in humble poverty, others indulged in excess. Manuscripts were copied by candlelight, not just to preserve scripture, but to maintain control. Knowledge was hoarded, and those who sought to read or write without clerical permission could find themselves accused of blasphemy. Books were chained to lecterns, their secrets locked away like treasure. The nobility used religion as a shield and sword.
Kings ruled by divine right.
Wars were waged as holy crusades, with peasants conscripted to fight for a faith they barely understood. Knights, dripping in armor and adorned with crosses, believed killing in God's name absolved them of sin. Entire villages were burned to cleanse them of heresy, and the victors built churches upon the ashes. And yet, through all this, through bloodshed and prayer, through torment and divine song, the people believed. They clung to their faith not because it was kind, but because it was all they had. The afterlife promised paradise, where hunger ceased and suffering ended. Heaven was the reward for enduring hell on earth. For many, that was enough. But beneath this blanket of divine belief festered doubt. Quiet, creeping doubt. A mother who lost all her children to the plague wondered why her prayers went unanswered. A young boy beaten by a priest questioned the holiness of his tormentor. A woman accused of witchcraft, knowing she had done nothing wrong, looked to the heavens not with hope, but with betrayal. Religion in the medieval world was not just a guiding force, it was an all-encompassing storm. It nurtured and destroyed, uplifted and crushed. It was the light in the cathedral and the fire beneath the pyre. It was comfort, but it was also control. And as the centuries dragged forward, the whispers of rebellion grew louder. Not all would remain silent. Not all would bow forever. Yet for the average man or woman of the time, silence was survival. Faith was armor. And superstition was the only explanation in a world too brutal, too mysterious, and too unfair to ever make sense without it. Death was not an event in the medieval world. It was a presence. It lingered in every village, in every whisper of wind that carried the scent of rot, in every corner of every wooden hut that echoed with coughs and prayers. In this chapter, we dive into the darkest truths of medieval existence, the ever-present threat of disease, the grim dance with death, and the chilling uncertainty that came with every breath. This is not just history. It is a haunting journey into the frailty of life when medicine was myth and survival was a miracle. The average medieval man or woman did not expect to live long. Life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years, but that figure is misleading. It includes the devastatingly high infant mortality rate that claimed up to half of all children before they reached their 5th birthday. If you survived childhood, you still had to navigate a life riddled with dangers. War, famine, childbirth, infections, and unspeakable illnesses that had no known cure. From your first cry to your last gasp, you lived on the edge of the abyss. One of the greatest threats in this brutal era was the plague. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it swept through Europe like an invisible scythe, cutting down rich and poor alike. Whole towns fell silent. Fields went untilled. Markets emptied. The bells of churches tolled without pause as bodies piled in the streets. Some villages lost every single inhabitant. The disease was merciless. Boils the size of apples, delirium, vomiting blood. Death often arrived within days, and no one understood why. Many believed it was divine punishment. Others blamed the stars, or the Jews, or the lepers. Superstition filled the void left by ignorance. Imagine living in such a world. Imagine watching your family members cough, spasm, and die, unable to help them, unable to even comfort them, as fear of contagion tore apart love and loyalty. Priests refused to perform last rites. Physicians fled cities. Children abandoned their parents, and mothers abandoned their babies. Death made cowards of them all. But the plague was just the most infamous of many horrors. Leprosy disfigured its victims, making them outcasts. Tuberculosis devoured lungs slowly, whispering its way through entire families. Dysentery turned water, the most basic element of life, into a conduit of death. Women risked their lives every time they gave birth. A minor cut could fester into a fatal infection. An aching tooth could lead to blood poisoning. The human body, already worn down by poor diet and harsh labor, rarely had the strength to fight back. And there was no true medicine, not as we know it today. Barbers doubled as surgeons, amputating limbs with blades they used to shave beards. Remedies included ground-up bones, bloodletting, herbs blessed by monks, and prayers whispered over potions that often caused more harm than healing. You didn't go to a hospital for care. You went there to die in agony, away from your family. The lucky ones died quickly. The psychological toll was immense. People lived in a constant state of dread. Every headache, every fever, every tremor could be the beginning of the end. In some towns, death was so frequent that coffins were reused and corpses buried in mass graves. Children played near open pits of decay, not understanding the horror they witnessed. Death became a neighbor, a companion, a silent judge watching from every shadow. Religion, of course, dominated the understanding of death. The church preached that illness was divine punishment for sin. If you suffered, it was because God willed it. This doctrine gave the clergy immense power, but it also chained the minds of the people. Rather than seek real causes or solutions, the suffering masses repented, flagellated themselves, and offered their pain as sacrifice. Some wandered the countryside in groups, whipping themselves bloody to beg for God's mercy. Others accused women of witchcraft, burning them alive for imaginary crimes. The rich did not escape this terror. Though they had more food, better shelter, and some access to care, death still came. Nobles died just as horribly as peasants. Castles became prisons when illness crept through their gates. And because doctors lacked even the basic knowledge of germs, their treatments for the wealthy were just as dangerous: bleeding, purging, enemas, and elixirs laced with mercury or lead. Death was also part of everyday culture. People carved skulls into their churches. Art depicted the danse macabre, a dance of skeletons mocking the living. Children grew up watching public executions and hearing sermons about hellfire. They learned early that life was short, suffering was guaranteed, and salvation was uncertain. Yet somehow they kept going. Farmers still tilled the soil. Mothers still sang to their babies. Bells still rang for weddings and funerals alike. There was courage in that persistence. To live in the medieval world was to endure, to find meaning in family, in community, in faith, even when those things offered no safety. It was to walk beside death every day and still find reasons to laugh, to love, to dream. This chapter is not just about physical suffering. It is about the emotional cost of living in a time where every breath could be your last. Imagine the quiet despair of a father watching his child convulse in a straw bed. The trembling hand of a midwife trying to stop the bleeding of a young mother. The cries of a brother digging a grave for his sister. Imagine the silence that followed when the last words were spoken and the last candle extinguished. In the medieval world, death was not a mystery. It was a certainty. But perhaps the greater mystery was how people still clung to life, still fought for every day, still told stories, sang songs, and lit candles against the night. And as we close this chapter, we must ask ourselves, could you have endured this? Could you have kept hope alive while everything around you died? The next time you complain about a headache or a long wait at the clinic, remember this: your ancestors walked barefoot through a world of sickness and survived. Their strength runs in your veins. Their sorrow shaped your world. But their suffering must not be forgotten. Justice in the medieval world was as much about control and fear as it was about law. It began not in courtrooms or behind desks with judges in robes, but in whispers, accusations, and assumptions born from suspicion and a society desperate to protect what little order it could muster. The feudal system, rigid and hierarchical, left little room for fairness. If you were poor, your voice was barely heard. If you were wealthy or noble, you held the power of accusation, judgment, and sometimes execution in your very hands. And at the center of this dark web of consequences was a belief that order was sacred and that harsh punishment was the only way to maintain it. Imagine being wrongly accused of stealing a loaf of bread. No trial, no lawyer, no investigation, just a mob, a bailiff, and a decision. You could be locked in a dank dungeon, chained to a wall, your skin feeding the rats. Or worse, you could be dragged into the town square, forced to endure the shame of public punishment, flogging, branding, or even the stocks, where townspeople were encouraged to jeer, spit, or throw refuse. The goal was humiliation, and with it, the belief that the fear of shame would deter others. But it rarely did. Hunger and desperation have always been more powerful than fear. Justice varied from village to village, depending on who ruled the land. A peasant might be judged by a local lord who had absolute authority and whose whims became law. There was no appeal. If the lord believed the accused was guilty, the sentence could be death, even if the crime was trivial. Others were judged by church courts, especially if they were clergy or the offense involved religion. These courts were often just as brutal, though cloaked in the language of divine will and spiritual redemption. Medieval justice was laced with spectacle. Executions were public. They were rituals of fear, warnings to the crowd that any rebellion, theft, or defiance would be met with pain and death. A hanging was not just punishment, it was theater. People would gather in droves, children sitting on shoulders, vendors selling food, laughter and chatter filling the air, until the accused was let out, trembling, sometimes sobbing, other times silent with resignation. The noose, the sword, the fire, all became symbols not just of justice, but of a society obsessed with control. Trial by ordeal was another horror. If evidence was lacking, a person could be subjected to one of several ordeals designed to test their innocence by appealing to divine judgment. A common one was the ordeal by fire. The accused would carry a red-hot iron a set distance, and if the wound healed cleanly, they were deemed innocent. If it festered, they were guilty. Or there was the ordeal by water, in which the accused was bound and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were considered guilty, because water, a pure element, was said to reject their body. If they sank, they were innocent, though drowning was a common result. Prisons were rarely used for long-term sentences. They were holding cells, dirty, disease-ridden, dark, and damp. Prisoners were often shackled, denied food, and sometimes tortured for confessions. There was no rehabilitation. The idea that someone could be corrected or changed through education or therapy was unthinkable. Punishment was about example, fear, and divine justice. For women, justice was often harsher and more humiliating. A woman accused of gossip or defiance could be made to wear a scold's bridle, a metal cage locked onto her head with a bit placed in her mouth to prevent speech. Women suspected of adultery or witchcraft faced public shaming, beatings, or execution. Witch hunts were a perversion of justice, fueled by paranoia, misogyny, and superstition. One accusation could end a life, especially if the accused was old, poor, or eccentric. A birthmark, a strange herb, or an unkind word could become evidence of demonic possession. Children weren't spared. While very young children were sometimes shown leniency, those even slightly older could be punished harshly. A child caught stealing might be beaten in public or even hanged, depending on the Lord's disposition. The law did not consider psychological development or trauma. It considered only obedience, order, and consequence. Even animals could be tried in court. There are historical records of pigs being hanged for killing children, or cows being executed for causing damage. These bizarre acts reflect a worldview that tried to extend human law to all living things, a desperate attempt to impose order in a chaotic world. Punishments for crimes ranged from financial penalties to mutilation. A thief might have his hand cut off. A liar might be branded. An arsonist could be burned alive. The concept of proportional justice, the punishment fitting the crime, was not always practiced. Instead, punishments were designed to instill fear, make an example, and reinforce the power of those who ruled. Torture was often sanctioned, especially for extracting confessions. The rack, the thumbscrew, the Iron Maiden, these weren't just legends. They were real tools used to twist limbs, break bones, and shred dignity. Torture wasn't about truth. People confessed to anything to make it stop. But once a confession was obtained, the sentence was often swift and irreversible. Despite the brutality, there were moments of mercy. Some lords were known for fairness. Some monasteries offered sanctuary to the accused, protecting them for a time within the church walls. And as the centuries passed, systems began to slowly evolve. Juries emerged. Trials became more structured. Laws were written and codified. But in the heart of the medieval world, justice remained a terrifying force, arbitrary, cruel, and absolute. To live in such a time meant constantly being aware of how fragile your existence was. One word, one accusation, one bad harvest, or one disapproving glance could lead to ruin.
There were no civil rights.
There were no protections. There was only survival. And if you were ever unlucky enough to stand before a lord or beneath a noose, you would understand just how sharp and unforgiving the blade of medieval justice could be. In the end, justice in the Middle Ages wasn't just a system. It was a weapon. It was fear. It was the quiet knowledge that no one, not even the innocent, was truly safe. The battlefield of the medieval world was not a place of clean heroism or chivalrous duels. It was a theater of chaos, cruelty, and carnage. Those who stepped onto it, whether willingly or by force, were often swallowed by its merciless brutality. In a time when personal disputes, territorial ambitions, and dynastic rivalries erupted into full-blown wars, the battlefield became both a proving ground and a death sentence. It wasn't just knights in shining armor who fought. Peasants, mercenaries, and conscripted villagers also bled into the soil. This chapter plunges deep into the bloody heart of medieval warfare, peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the horrifying truth underneath. We will explore the causes of war, the gruesome weaponry, the savage tactics, and the psychological torment that haunted soldiers and civilians alike. War could begin over something as seemingly insignificant as a marriage alliance gone wrong or a slight against a noble's honor. The feudal system ensured that once a lord declared war, all his vassals and their men were expected to join, regardless of their will. Drafted peasants, armed with little more than pitchforks and rusted blades, marched alongside trained soldiers. They left behind families who knew that most would never return. For many, their first glimpse of the enemy would be their last. In many cases, these peasants were barely trained and wholly unprepared for the chaos of combat. Battles were not swift, elegant affairs. They were long, drawn-out encounters, often beginning at dawn and lasting until dusk. Soldiers stood in heavy, sweltering armor under the scorching sun or freezing rain. The stench of sweat, blood, and fear lingered in the air like a curse. As soon as the horns blew, lines of men would crash into each other with bone-breaking force. Steel clanged against steel, flesh tore, screams filled the sky. Limbs were severed, skulls cracked, and intestines spilled across muddy fields. Archers released storms of arrows that rained down death indiscriminately. Horses trampled the wounded. Victory belonged not to the righteous, but to the ruthless. The psychological strain on those who survived was immense. There was no name for post-traumatic stress, but the symptoms were evident. Insomnia, violent outbursts, numbness. Soldiers returned with haunted eyes, plagued by visions of comrades torn apart before them. Villagers who witnessed their towns burned, their families slaughtered, or their homes razed lived with constant fear. The scars of war etched themselves into minds as deeply as they did into the land. Weaponry in the medieval battlefield was designed not for efficiency, but for cruelty. The flail, a spiked ball attached to a chain, could cave in a helmeted skull. The morning star inflicted gruesome puncture wounds. Longbows could pierce armor, and crossbows shattered bones from afar. Swords, axes, halberds, each weapon was a tool of terror. Even siege equipment, like trebuchets and battering rams, brought destruction on a monstrous scale. Castles, once thought impregnable, could be reduced to rubble within hours. Sieges were a particularly horrifying aspect of medieval warfare. They could last for weeks or months, starving out those within. Diseases like dysentery and typhoid often claimed more lives than swords. Civilians, women, children, and the elderly were caught in the middle, often reduced to eating rats or even the corpses of the dead. When the walls were finally breached, what followed was not mercy, but massacre. Survivors were raped, tortured, and executed as examples. For those who fought under the banner of chivalry, the ideals quickly faded under the weight of bloodshed. Knights were supposed to embody honor, courage, and mercy, but war twisted them. Many knights became brutal enforcers of their lord's ambitions, reveling in the violence. Others fell in battle, their shiny armor offering little protection against blunt trauma or a lucky arrow. The church, while preaching peace, often sanctioned war through holy justifications. The Crusades, for example, turned faith into a weapon. Men were told they'd earn salvation by killing in the name of God. Pilgrims became warriors, and sacred ground became slaughterhouses. The battlefield was transformed into a religious theater, where sins could supposedly be washed clean with blood. Animals too suffered in these wars. Horses, bred and trained for battle, were armored and sent charging into enemy lines. Their screams, when injured, echoed across fields. War dogs were used to maul the wounded. Even livestock was slaughtered to deprive enemy camps of food, creating famine wherever armies marched. After battles ended, the dead were often left to rot. Mass graves were sometimes dug, but many corpses simply decomposed in the open, feeding vultures and rats. The stench spread for miles. Rivers ran red. The living had to walk among the dead, their noses clogged with cloth to block the foulness. Diseases from unburied bodies often led to new outbreaks. In the aftermath, looting was common. Soldiers would strip corpses of armor, weapons, or valuables. Villages were pillaged, churches desecrated, women taken. A soldier's reward was not glory, but whatever he could carry. And when the victors celebrated, it was not in honor, but in relief that they had simply survived. Peace, when it came, was fragile. Truces were often broken within months. The next war was always on the horizon. Children grew up expecting to fight. Boys learned to wield swords before they could read. Girls learned to tend wounds and bury loved ones. The medieval world was a place where war shaped every life. This chapter is not a tale of glory. It is a requiem for the countless nameless souls who fought, bled, and died in battles that history barely remembers. Behind every shining sword and noble crest was a battlefield soaked in sorrow. And in the end, for the common man, war was not a path to honor. It was a grave. You stand at the edge of the village now. Behind you, the shouts of a feudal lord's servant echo through the trees. Ahead, nothing but fog and forest, filled with wolves, some on 4 legs, some on 2. Your breath is ragged, your body aching, your stomach empty. It hasn't even been 24 hours. Why wouldn't you last a day? Let us walk back through the chaos that is medieval life. You arrived with modern expectations. You expected freedom of speech, choice in your career, your relationships, your body. Instead, you were born into a rigid social hierarchy, peasant, noble, or clergy. The position was not just assigned, it was inescapable. If you were born poor, you would die poor. The latter didn't exist. The very idea of climbing it was absurd. You expected hygiene. You didn't get soap, you got a bucket of muddy water. You didn't get deodorant, you got rags stuffed under your armpits. You didn't get privacy, you shared a wooden hut with 10 others and a pig. You thought disease could be treated. You thought pain could be numbed. But medicine in the Middle Ages was more dangerous than helpful. Doctors believed in humors, leeches, and prayers. A broken leg meant either amputation or infection. A fever meant bloodletting. A toothache? It would be ripped out with pliers, no anesthetic, just screaming. The food that once comforted you, gone. No pizza, no chocolate, no coffee. Just stale bread, porridge, maybe a root vegetable if the harvest didn't fail. And if you were lucky enough to get meat, you'd hope it wasn't rotten. There was no refrigeration. Salt was gold. You hoped for safety, but law was arbitrary. Justice wasn't blind, it was brutal. For theft, you might lose a hand. For gossip, you could be flogged. For witchcraft, a woman could be drowned to prove she wasn't a witch. If she died, she was innocent. If she lived, she was guilty and burned. You imagine love, but marriage wasn't about love. It was arranged, often at age 12 or 13. Women were property. Men were expected to fight, die, or work until their bodies gave up. Intimacy was a function, not a feeling. You thought religion brought peace, but in the Middle Ages it brought war, crusades, torture, inquisition. You either believed or burned. Heresy was not a conversation, it was a sentence. You expected choice, but there was none. You couldn't choose your job, your partner, your clothes, your food, or even your name in some cases. Individuality was discouraged.
Conformity kept you alive.
You believed you were strong, mentally tough, physically fit. But a simple splinter could kill you. A fever could take your life in 2 days. The childbirth that gave you life in the modern world would have taken your mother's life in the medieval one. The strength you thought you had It meant little in a world without medicine, sanitation, or mercy. You expected shelter, but you got damp, rat-infested huts. You expected warmth, but winters froze crops and bodies. You expected peace, but war was constant. Nobles feuded endlessly, and peasants paid the price. Your village might be raided, burned, and forgotten in an afternoon. You thought you'd adapt, but time wasn't kind in the Middle Ages. It didn't move forward, it dragged. Each day was a test of endurance, not just for survival, but for the will to keep going in a world where joy was rare and death was always near. So, why wouldn't you last a day? Because the medieval world wasn't designed for you. Because you expect answers, but they believed in fate. Because you expect fairness, but they lived in fear. Because your comforts are modern, but their struggles were eternal. Because the Middle Ages didn't wait for anyone, not even you. And so, we ask you now, could you have survived a day in the medieval world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you have risen as a knight, prayed as a monk, worked as a peasant, or perished before the sun set? Let us know. The medieval world awaits your judgment. And so, as the candle flickers and the echoes of the past grow quiet, we're left with one haunting truth. The Middle Ages were no place for the weak, the naive, or the unprepared. A world ruled by iron and fire, by plague and power, where every breath was a battle, and survival was never guaranteed. Could you last a day? Perhaps not. But understanding that world just might help us appreciate our own. If you made it this far, you're one of the few brave souls who dare to look history in the eye. If you enjoyed this journey through the brutal heart of the past, make sure to backhand index pointing right like this video. Backhand index pointing right subscribe for more immersive historical tales. Backhand index pointing right and drop a comment below. Would you survive a day in medieval times? Why or why not? Your voice matters, and your story might just be our next adventure.